Chapter 11. I had no expectations of my trip to Sri Lanka. I knew we had one stopover in a place called Bangkok, wherever that was. The region was a complete mystery to me. I knew the name of every country in Africa, thanks to my teacher in Jerusalem who hammered it into us. From him, I also knew the name of every world leader. He had saved each Time magazine cover that had a picture of a world leader and forced us to memorize their name, the context, and insisted that we learn why they were important. At the time, I resented him for it, but even in the short time since I had left school, I had been able to make sense of news stories because of Mr. Talbot's forceful teaching style. He wanted us to know about the world, not just from our international friends, but from a political understanding. So I could point to every country in Africa as well as the Middle East and name it. The same with Europe, but Asia, that was something different. I had no idea. Besides the obvious ones like China and India, I was clueless. I realized how little I knew once we landed in Bangkok and we walked the streets trying to find our hostel. We had stopped at a little cafe and Mr. Bean ordered food for us. I had never in my life tasted anything like it. I sat there and marveled at the flavors exploding in my mouth. It was spicy, yet sweet, creamy, yet bits of crunch. My mind was trying to make sense of the flavors. It was years later that I realized that one of the flavors that I had first encountered that night in the bustling metropolis of Bangkok was lemongrass. I hadn't even considered sleeping arrangements for the trip. I had such a relaxed attitude when it came to guys. Not only did I have 3 brothers, but I hung out with the guys in my youth group as if they were brothers too. I had spent plenty of nights on floors shared with them as we camped or wanted to stay up for an occasion. It was never an issue. In fact, I really got along better with guys than with girls. I felt it was easier to relate to them, much less drama. As long as they weren't violent, I felt so much better in the company than with a pack of girls. So having to share a small hostel room with Mr. Bean was not even worth a mention. It was only when I caught a whiff of his nerves just before bed that it hit me that this might be awkward for him to be traveling alone with a girl half his age. After a night in Bangkok, we flew to Sri Lanka. Colombo greeted us in its full glory. We arrived early morning and the city was already bustling with life. I couldn't believe the intensity of the heat and the humidity. I felt as if my lungs had filled with hot water and it was hard to catch a breath. I had always struggled with humidity. It seemed as if I was more suited to the cold climate of Sweden, where I was born, than the humidity of Florida, where I was conceived. I quickly realized that the clothes that I had brought were not going to be appropriate. I was dripping with sweat, and we had only just left the airport. We had to spend a couple of days in Colombo while waiting for Danya to arrive from Israel. I just couldn't get over the swarms of people. How was it possible to squeeze that many people into one space? And how could they all be so tiny? I felt like a giant. We caught a train from an old, beautiful train station and traveled down the coast. We then spent the day in the port of Galle, a beautiful seaside town with gorgeous old buildings. We had lunch at a fancy hotel that made me feel as if we were on a movie set. It was very sweet of Mr. Bean to take me here and show me a few of the sights. I had expected to be doing ministry straight away and hadn't even considered being able to feel like a tourist for the first time in my life. Danya arrived, and it felt so good to be reunited with my friend. Our connection was still there. After a year in Australia, where conversations were so different to what I was used to, it was incredible to finally have my friend that I could speak to in a way that resonated with my mind. Our conversations Our conversations stretched and challenged me. We both desired to learn more and to see more and to be more. Danya tapped into a part of me that not so many of my friends knew about, that part of me that had been starving for a year and so hungry for substance. Even in a Christian setting, my conversations in Australia never seemed to go into the areas that interested me. Puddle conversations, I used to call them. To finally have access to Danya was a breath of fresh air for my mind as well as my soul. We grinned at each other. Here we were in Sri Lanka, dressed as nuns, ready to drive up the East Coast to spend a month in an orphanage. Isn't this exactly what we'd been dreaming about in Jerusalem as teenagers? The drive took longer than expected because there were so many roadblocks and checkpoints. Each time our car was stopped, it had to be searched for explosives and weapons. We did our best to look like stoic nuns. It wasn't hard. Neither Danya nor I were scared. This was easy. Danya had just spent 2 years being in the Israeli military police. She had searched plenty of cars herself. She knew what was involved. If anyone looked nervous, it was Mr. Bean. We finally arrived at the orphanage. The sun was setting and the water in front of the white building was reflecting the orange and the purple from the sky above. It was beautiful. The children who greeted us were also beautiful. The boys had already gone to their building for the night, so we only had the girls to greet us, all wearing bright white shirts and blue skirts, their identical black oiled hair parted in the middle into 2 braids. Their faces shone with giant smiles greeting us. We were immediately surrounded by girls that wanted to hug us and be the first to hold our hands. They wanted to tell us their names and ages in their sing-song English. Mr. Bean was clearly loved as well. I had never seen him so happy and so full of expression. This awkward little businessman from Sydney seemed to take on a new persona in the context of the orphanage. For starters, he wasn't short anymore. Compared to the locals, he actually seemed quite tall. And here he mattered, and he had status. He was important, and they treated him like royalty. I could see why he loved coming here so much. Maybe this wasn't so much about him helping the orphans. Maybe they were helping him, making him feel powerful. I was getting pulled into a dorm by a swarm of orphans and lost sight of Mr. Bean. The girls wanted us to see where they slept, and they wanted to show us their belongings. They only had 2 or 3 items each: a comb, an old box or a trinket, a faded photo of a loved parent now gone because of a civil war that no one seemed to be able to explain to me. Danya and I were going from bed to bed, each girl so excited to have us there and wanting us to know about them. They wanted to be validated. It was evening and we needed to eat before heading to the guest house where we were staying. The swarm of girls showed us the seats in the eating area. Flower petals had been placed around our table, indicating our status as esteemed guests. I noticed that we had knives and forks. No one else did, just the 3 visitors. I looked over at Danya. She had moved hers out of the way, just like I had. If everyone was eating with their dal and rice with their hands, so were we. The girls thought it was hilarious. They had never had visitors before that ate like them. They tried to show us how to grab the rice and dip it in the dal and place it in our mouths without making a mess. We must have looked so funny. The girls were all giggling at us and beaming with their giant smiles. Even though they had made a special pot of dal just for us that wasn't spicy, our mouths were burning. I love the taste of curry powder, but this was something different. This made my eyes water. I gulped down the sweet milky tea and tried to focus on the rice. We were made to feel so welcome. The girls obviously adored having us there. Not only was this an orphanage for children whose parents had died from the Civil War and landmines and shootings or even from malnutrition, this was also a training center to give these orphans a chance for employment once they finished school. I respected the man who was in charge of the orphanages so much. He had not only seen a need to house and feed these abandoned children, but as they grew, he had come up with new ways to look after their long-term needs. The boys were taught mechanics and the girls sewing. Up until recently, this hadn't been available, and so many of these young girls were being sent off to rich families in the Middle East as maids. They were called maids, but it really was a form of modern-day slavery. Many of them were never seen again. Small amounts of money were sent back each month as the girls worked long hours in often cruel homes. I met one of these young women, a single mom. She was only about 18. She was very lucky to have come back to her village in Sri Lanka. She thought she was going to die in Lebanon. The family she was with would beat her daily. All she wanted to do was be back home with her little boy. She now worked at the orphanage as a helper and got to see her son in the evenings. She was so grateful. Danya and I weren't exactly sure what we were going to do at the orphanage. We figured that we would be told what was expected of us. No one seemed to know. The girls tried to teach us their songs as they brushed our hair for hours at a time. Tamil words made my tongue twist inside out. How was I supposed to make those sounds? Danya seemed to find it much easier and was singing along with the girls within a couple of days. We in turn taught them how to make friendship bracelets. We had found a little shop selling string in the nearby town, and the girls loved to choose colors and come up with the new designs. Danya and I had spent hours doing this back in our days as summer camp leaders in Israel, and it was just as much fun over here in Sri Lanka. We taught the girls songs as well. We had so many to choose from, but there was one that was an absolute favorite, the Hokey Pokey. No matter how much we tried to sing our much more refined options, it was the Hokey Pokey that won. The girls couldn't get enough. They thought it was hilarious and loved the actions and would collapse laughing after each round. How could we deny them such joy? We sang it over and over again. Their laughter was infectious. We spent a bit of time with the boys as well. Not as much, but a couple of hours each day. They liked to play volleyball with us on one of the patches of grass. A net had been stretched out between the two trees, and despite the heat, Danya and I would play a game or two in the afternoon once school classes were finished. We did this a few times until one unfortunate day when my foot got caught in a hole hidden in the tall grass. I tripped over and managed to twist my ankle in the process. My foot turning all shades of blue and purple was completely fascinating to these inquisitive children. After a few moments of staring in wonder, I had some of them come up and poke and prod my foot. So curious that a body could create those colors all on its own. I was surrounded by a sea of faces and I was in so much pain. Danya was trying not to laugh. I was lying on the ground in agony with a circle of kids all around me in awe of my now very purple foot. I was eventually helped to a clinic in town and had to risk my life hopping across a very busy road in order to get there, the whole time having Danya trying to hold me out while laughing until she cried. Thanks to my white skin, I was seen straight away. I felt so guilty being led directly into the doctor while mothers with lifeless babies were still waiting in a long queue outside. No one said anything and no one complained. Of course, having white skin means you get superior treatment. My one-footed status didn't really make a big difference to my day. I could still have my hair brushed. I could still make friendship bracelets. I wasn't able to participate in the ongoing hokey pokey love fest, but I could watch. The other thing I could do was take photos. I realized very quickly that none of these kids had photos of themselves. I told Danya that I needed her help because I wanted to give the children a gift when we left the orphanage. I explained to them that they were each able to have 2 photos, one of themselves and one with their siblings or friends. They were so excited. I wasn't exactly sure how I would pay for having these photos developed. It was going to be a lot of money on my very restricted budget, but I knew I had to do it. These children needed to be validated by having a photo of themselves. I knew how much my photos meant to me, and it was something I really wanted to do. It took a couple of days, but we managed to photograph all the kids, a portrait each, and then a more relaxed photo with a sibling or friend. The girls took this very seriously and spent a long time brushing their already perfect hair to look their best for the big moment. We were then invited to go out into the countryside to visit some of the poorer families. The man who ran the orphanage would often go out there and pray with the families and sometimes deliver some donated goods. Danya and I were happy to come along, and we got to visit quite a few families, each living in the tiniest huts you could possibly imagine a family living in. The floor was sand, perfectly swept sand. Some had even made a design in the sand with their homemade broomsticks made from dried out twigs. Their home was empty, an old pot and a few rolled up mats to sleep on. What struck me was how neat they were, absolutely spotless. So much care had gone into their home. Even in their absolute poverty, there was beauty. So different to the poverty that I had seen in America. The children that came to our church in Portland were the poorest of the poor. The few times I had gone to their homes, I would have to try my hardest not to gag from the smells that greeted me at the door. Broken toys scattered around and walls smeared with foul-smelling mud or worse. I didn't want to know. Broken windows, broken doors, broken mothers greeting us at the door. The poverty here in rural Sri Lanka was different. Each family member was perfectly clean with their hair oiled and combed. They were proud of their homes and invited us in. We had been cooked for. These families with absolutely nothing were wanting us to eat their food. We were then served curries made from crabs they had caught that morning, cooked in coconut milk from the coconuts that kept falling around us. Our mouths burning hot as we ate these lovingly made meals. I knew Danya was feeling the same way as me. How could we possibly sit there and eat while these families just watched us? Surely they needed it themselves. But no, they wanted us to eat and were grinning as we used our hands to eat their offerings. I will never forget their generosity and their happiness at seeing us in their homes. Most of the families we met had no fathers. The men had been killed in the war, leaving behind the mother to fend for themselves. There was no aid from the government, no safety net. They had to survive completely on their own. I felt so useless and wished I had something to offer. We were told that the leader of the Tamil Tigers had heard that we were visiting and he wanted to meet us. Mr. Bean explained that this was really a great honor and we shouldn't feel afraid. Afraid? Why would we be afraid? If he was inviting us over, then there was nothing to be afraid of. Danya was similar to me. Status never intimidated or impressed. People were just that, people. So what if this dude was the head of the terrorist organization? Surely he was just like the rest of us. And he was. Just like we thought. He offered us very sweet milky tea and biscuits, and then he introduced us to his monkey that lived on his shoulder. He asked us about Israel. He was impressed that both of us knew how to shoot Uzis and M16s. Just a lovely afternoon tea under the Sri Lankan sun. I pulled my camera out to take photos of his beloved monkey. 2 guards who had been very quiet jumped up. No photos, no photos. I hadn't realized the security factor around our visit and what a big deal it was to have this man meeting 2 Westerners. In the end, he agreed to let me photograph him and his cheeky friend as long as I promised to not get the photos developed in Sri Lanka. I would have to get them developed back in Australia. I agreed, but I was slightly frustrated. I knew that it was much cheaper to get film developed in Sri Lanka, and I had so many photos to print for the orphans. Now it was going to cost even more. Our month in Sri Lanka was coming to an end. There was only one more event that needed to happen before our departure. The orphanage had been working hard on creating a garden. It was a beautiful space with little paths and miniature hills with gorgeous tropical flowers that had been carefully planted. It was a magical space, and there was going to be a ceremony to celebrate the occasion. It had taken quite a few years to get this dream to fruition, and everyone was very excited about the big day. A couple of days earlier, the head of the orphanage had told us that he wanted me and Danya to name the garden. It was a very big honor. We were really touched by his request, and we wanted to come up with the perfect name. In the end, we settled on a Hebrew word, tikva. It's the name of the Israeli national anthem, and it means hope. That was our message to this beautiful group of children that we had fallen in love with. Even though they loved to sneak up behind us and put lice in our hair, lice that they had found in their own daily grooming sessions, we had fallen in love with each one of them. Yet we had nothing to offer. Well, besides lots of friendship bracelets and a new song that was sure to bring them hours of joy. Hope was the best we could do. I spent a couple of days painting a sign for the entry to the garden. They wanted it both in Hebrew and English, and it was ready just in time for the big day. After much pleading and begging by the children, Danya and I promised that we would wear saris for the special occasion. No one dared to believe that it was true. 2 white girls wearing their beloved saris. This was the hot topic. The boys kept asking us, Miss, will it really happen? Will you really wear a sari? We agreed that if we could find a sari that fit, we would each be wearing one. Much to my surprise, they had giant-sized saris on offer, and there was no escaping it. Both me and Danya appeared on the morning of the celebrations wearing saris. We hadn't realized how much this actually meant to the kids, but we could see it on their faces when we arrived. Despite me still hobbling on my foot, we were 2 goddesses that had just arrived in their enchanted garden. The excitement level reached new highs. Even though we had arrived early in the morning, the orphanage had already been transformed for the big day. Flower garlands were draped everywhere. Mandalas made from grated coconut and rice, colored with flower petals and spices, were carefully being finished off on the ground, and then surrounded by more flowers. As we entered the garden, kids ran up to us to drape flower garlands around our necks. Strand after strand was placed over our heads as each beaming child lined up with their lovingly made garland. It was getting heavy. I was an easier target, being quite a bit shorter than Danya, but I could see that she was struggling under the weight of the flower garlands as well. This was going to be a long day. I hadn't realized that a lot of people were driving up from Colombo for the ceremony. Sponsors of the orphanage, church leaders, and even the bishop were joining us. They were all arriving in polished cars, and they all wanted to meet the 2 young women from Jerusalem. The sun was getting higher in the sky, and the flowers were getting heavier around our necks. Eventually, the ceremony officially started. The children sang. I'm pretty sure that me and Danya sang a song in Hebrew as well. It's hard to remember because we were pretty delirious by this stage. I was again reminded of how well behaved these children were compared to other kids I had come across in my travels. Not once did they have to be told to be quiet. They sat completely still during a very long and hot ceremony, not once shifting from their spot on the floor, faces glowing with excitement and just so happy to be part of such a momentous occasion. Eventually, me and Danya were asked to cut the flower garland that had been placed across the entrance to the garden, and my hand-painted sign was revealed from beneath the cloth that had been covering it to build excitement. Everyone applauded and carefully made their way into the beautiful oasis to admire the beautiful flowers and plants. Our month had come to an end. Our work at the orphanage was done. I wasn't exactly sure what work had actually been accomplished. I felt that I had been given a lot more than I had offered. I knew the photos would be a hit, and I knew that we had made lots of kids very happy, but no, the month there had only highlighted to me that if I really wanted to give something, it needed to be long-term. Popping in for a month is almost cruel. All these kids getting so attached to you, and then you just head back to the comforts of your own home. It didn't feel right. Our month together in Sri Lanka was over. Danya and I needed to part ways. She was moving to Amman in Jordan to learn Arabic. Her Hebrew was already flawless. 12 years at an Israeli school, followed by 2 years in the army, meant that she was one of the locals, despite not actually having a citizenship. Her parents' insistence that she went to Hebrew school had paid off. She was now moving to Jordan to expand her language skills. Danya was already involved in a fantastic organization that did reconciliation work between Arabs and Jews, and a couple of years of intensive Arabic study would mean that she could be fluent in both languages. If it was possible, my admiration for this incredible woman just went up another level. She had the world at her fingertips. We smiled as we said goodbye, and we promised each other that we would keep having these spontaneous adventures. It hurt to say goodbye, but I was so grateful that she had joined me for a month as an undercover nun in Tiger Country. I was also heading back to my real life. I wasn't exactly sure if I was going to stay in Sydney or moving to the city called Adelaide, a city that I'd never quite worked out exactly where it was. Before leaving Sri Lanka, I had one stop to make. Alice's boyfriend had a cousin in Kandy, a beautiful mountain town in the cool hills of central Sri Lanka. It was famous for its tea plantations, and I had promised I would visit. Once I said goodbye to Mr. Bean in Colombo, I caught a train by myself to Kandy. I was left breathless at the beauty of the train ride up the hills. Rainforest on both sides of my train carriage, with birds that I had never seen before. Morpher would have been beside himself. There was no way I could capture any of it with my camera, so I just stared out the window in wonder of what I saw. As the train approached the station, I realized I had no idea who I was actually meeting. I had a moment of hoping that my new friend would have more information about me than I had about him. Alice's boyfriend was never that good with details. As it turned out, I didn't have to worry. This giant Fijian man was standing on the platform with a sea of miniature people around him. The crowd parted when I stepped off the train, and we were both ushered out to the waiting car. It took me a while to register what was going on. On the way to his house, we stopped at a temple to see a giant Buddha. We had only stepped out of the car when I realized that we were getting more attention than the Buddha himself. As it turned out, this giant I was visiting was in fact a bit of a celebrity. He was a rugby player that everyone seemed to know about, so there wasn't much sightseeing done, and instead we got stopped for autographs and posing for photos. I had 24 hours of feeling incredibly famous in the heart of Sri Lanka. I was very happy to hop on the train and catch my plane back to Sydney. As soon as I returned, I went back to the travel agent in Leichhardt to see if I could change my Adelaide flight. I felt that I needed a bit more thinking time. Change your ticket? No, sorry, but your ticket is non-refundable. You can't change it. There it was. I was moving to Adelaide. The decision had been made for me by a travel agent who hadn't been completely honest. I made a point of looking on the giant map in her office to locate this new home of mine, Adelaide. The city that I thought was Adelaide was in fact Melbourne, and the city I thought was Melbourne was Canberra. Adelaide was actually a bit further west, in the middle of nowhere it seemed, tucked into the bottom of this giant country I was still trying to get used to. Wow, I thought, that is far away from pretty much everything. I only had one last thing to do. I needed to develop those photos from the orphanage. When Dr. Moyes heard about my trip to Sri Lanka during my last Sunday evening church service in Sydney, he told me that he would pay for all the photos to be developed. I was so relieved. I definitely didn't know how I was going to pay for them, and I had made a promise to myself to find a way. A few days later, I was able to hand the 4 envelopes of photos over to Mr. Bean, who promised he would take them on his next trip to Sri Lanka. I had completed my task. Adelaide was waiting.